Hi there, BookTube. I'm recording this at the very beginning of December, and November just finished, and I have a little tinge of sadness at the start of this video because for years now, all the time I've been involved in BookTube, November, the month just gone, has been associated in my mind with reading nonfiction because of Nonfiction November, hosted by Olive of A Book Olive. But Olive announced that this was her last year of hosting Nonfiction November. Now I have a feeling that probably I'm not going to stop reading extra nonfiction in November in future years because it's kind of like embedded in my psyche now. But I wanted to make a video about the 4 nonfiction books that I read in November to go with Olive's 4 prompts, and as a sort of special celebration for me of how much I've enjoyed taking part in Nonfiction November over the years. So, and to just say a huge thank you to Olive for the lovely concept of doing a reading event to encourage us to really, enjoy the wonders that there are in reading nonfiction, which sometimes some of us, and myself included, are sort of tempted to ignore in favour of perhaps the more sparkling attractions for me of fiction. And I've had so many rich reading experiences from reading extra nonfiction due to Nonfiction November. So one of the lovely things about Nonfiction November each year was Olive's prompts, because unlike other, book event prompts, her prompts were always just single words that you could then use to as creatively as you could to match up with the books that you chose to read. And this year's prompts were code, join, path, and shot. And I found an interesting book to attach to each of those. So I'm going to talk you through those 4. Now, shot was a very welcome choice of prompt for me, because I was already hoping to read in November a book by a fellow booktuber, and that's Brian of Bookish, who I'm sure you will know his channel if you know mine, but I'll link to it anyway. And he brought out a book this year, and I'll give you the title. MacArthur's Bloody Butchers, Company G, 163rd Infantry Regiment in the Pacific War. Now, you'll gather from reading that this is a book of military history, and it's not my normal sort of book to read, but because it was written by Brian, I was eager to read it. I knew that he was sort of inspired to write this particular book by the experiences of his uncle in the Pacific War. So, there's a sort of a personal connection that attracted me. And, I know that anything that Brian wrote would be interesting, even if it wasn't, my usual sort of thing. And I was right, because I really enjoyed this book. And it was nice to be kind of, as I say, pulled out of my normal, comfort zone of reading, because, as I say, military history, not somewhere I would normally turn. But, as I say, what Brian has done in this book is he's combined 2 things. He's found a few American infantrymen, soldiers, who were in the same kind of regiment, and in fact mostly in the same company in World War II, in the Pacific War, who in some way it kept a personal record of their experiences. So whether they wrote a diary, were interviewed by someone later, as is the case with Brian's uncle, that was, recording that was kept, or wrote a memoir, somehow or other, all these men, there was a personal account of their experiences. And Brian's put those together, what she could glean from those, with the sort of broader, history of, what's known, the military records and military histories of the Pacific War and the American Army's participation in that. So, putting those two together, it's that combination of the micro and the macro, So you get some big picture stuff, which, if you're a European, you tend to know a lot more about the European side of World War II, and you know that the Pacific War in the Pacific was happening, and of course, many, British soldiers also took part in the war there, but an awful lot were from countries like Australia and New Zealand, and of course the Americans. So our familiarity is less with that side of the war. So that was the reason why this was interesting. Another thing that made it interesting for me in particular was that this is a book about young men, really young men. They're all, in their early to mid-20s, going through an exceptional experience. These young men were fighting in, Papua New Guinea and the Philippines and so on, and in the jungle. It was, a very intense experience. But warfare will always be, and we send these inexperienced youths almost to take part in that, and what impact does that have on them? And that interested me, I suppose, because my father was a young man in his early to mid-20s, who also was in World War II. In his case, in North Africa and Italy, and then at the very end of the war, he then was sent east to India, Singapore, and so on. And so, in reading about these young men, I suppose I felt a sense of connection with his experiences too. So, really, in sort of a book that I would not otherwise have chosen to read, but well written and with loads to expand my knowledge and understanding. So thank you, Brian, for that experience. The second of the prompts that I'm going to talk about is code. And for code, I read perhaps a better known nonfiction book of this year, and that's How to Say Babylon, a Jamaican memoir by Safiya Sinclair. Actually, I said it was from this year. That's because it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction in 2024, but it actually came out in 2023. So, it was very much a book that's been much spoken about this year, shall we say. Why code? Why does it fit the prompt code? Because it's about Sinclair's childhood and young womanhood, and how that was shaped and controlled by her father's code as a Rastafarian, and that is the central sort of thread of the book. Reading it, I learned a lot about Rastafari, and which I hadn't previously known, and including the fact that there's no sort of agreed set code or doctrine for Rastafarianism or Rastafari. It's that there are sort of versions of it, but almost each individual household, each man, can almost impose his own version of it as a religion, or his own code on his family. And that's what Sinclair's father did, in a way that it became quite violent and oppressive for her and her siblings. And it's a book about surviving that, I suppose. So it's got an element of the sort of the misery memoir about it, I suppose. But what sets it apart is that Sinclair is a really good writer. She's a poet. It was through education and books and literature that she kind of learnt, I suppose, to question her father's code, and ultimately found her route out, her escape route, and if she survived psychologically, I guess the love of her mother was also a key factor in that. Beautiful prose, tremendous sort of sense of place, sense of time, it's an emotional book. I'm not a huge fan, I suppose, of books about miserable childhoods. I don't. It's not like I disapprove of people writing them or something, but they can become a bit. I don't know. You sort of slightly. Sometimes I slightly. No, this makes me out to be a really nasty person. But I almost lose patience with the repetition of awfulness. Does that make me a bad person? How do you feel about that sort of book? I don't know. The sort of multi-layered literary quality of this sort of sustained me, but I think Sinclair wanted us to understand that her route out of that violence and poverty and oppression was not a swift one and not an easy one, and that's quite hard to read, I suppose. Yeah. So slightly mixed feelings, but really, really, really good book. Definitely one I would recommend. But with that slight reservation, there we go. I mean, God, the sexism that she faced, and then racism as well, and prejudice about Rastafarians. I mean, really fascinating, and the sort of political context really interesting too. So you see lots to like about this very multi-layered book, but it's just how much sort of misery do you want to read? You decide. Now, the next prompt word that I'm going to talk about is join. And for this, I read a more sort of straight non-fiction book, which I try and make myself do in non-fiction in November, because very often my main diet of non-fiction is memoirs or literary biographies, that sort of thing, rather than, a sort of classic non-fiction books, if you know what I mean. And so I read Prisoners of Geography, 10 maps that tell you everything you need to know about global politics by Tim Marshall. Now, this came out in 2015, but the edition I read was revised in 2019, so to bring it slightly more up to date, which is great. And why do I think it fits the word join? Because really it's about how how countries join, how they intersect physically, their geography and their natural or imposed borders kind of influence geopolitics, to influence how countries develop and how they relate, their interrelationships with other countries. So it's all about the joins, I'd say. Classic example of that in the book is the relationship between China and India. Now, they could be they're two growing powers that one might almost anticipate would either need to be closely allied or might be rivals. But the fact that they are divided by the join between them is defined by the Himalayas, a more or less impassable, mountain range, changes the dynamic and means that their relationship can be actually, quite different. That's one example. What would be another? Russia. He really explains why Russia's lack of a kind of strong natural border to the west, so between Russia and the sort of North European plain, as he describes it, has shaped Russia's attitude to her Western neighbours. So why she's tried to, as a nation, to expand in that direction, to try and control neighbouring countries in that direction, wanting Belarus and the Baltic states and Ukraine and Georgia and so on to be under Russian influence as a buffer zone to protect the Russian heartland. And obviously this was true historically, true in when Ivan the Terrible was building the original Russian Empire, and is still true today in terms of why Russia has invaded Ukraine. So this book, Prisoner of Geography, is the kind of book that puts the jigsaw pieces together, joins it up in your mind, makes those connections. Marshall is a journalist, so he knows how to create a sort of an intelligent synthesis of other people's research and knowledge with his sort of years of experience of writing about world politics and international relations. So not a stylistically amazing book, but smart and interesting, and the kind of book that leaves you feeling like, oh yes, I understand that a little bit better now. That's nice. I shall use that in my when I look at the world. So thank you, Tim Marshall, for that helpful book. Then my fourth nonfiction book for Nonfiction November, and maybe my favourite, perhaps, was the one I chose for Path. And the book is Wilding by Isabella Tree, and it's somewhere between memoir and nature writing and almost a kind of manifesto for a different path, a different way of managing the landscape or land, or even kind of not managing it. It was one of the inspirational books for the rewilding movement, but Isabella Tree deliberately chooses to call it wilding rather than rewilding because, the complexity of the issues around this. So it's fits Path because she and her husband Charles Burrell were kind of forging in effect quite a new path for a British landowner in stepping away from intensive agriculture, leaving nature to find its own way of restoring habitats, whilst not having no intervention, as in introducing animals that would sort of act in the way that their prehistoric forebears would have done in shaping habitats by grazing, by pigs that root around, by how they use the landscape helps create a particular kind of mixed habitat that turns out to be incredibly fruitful for the return of natural species, from the smallest insects through to premium species that we love to have back, like turtle doves and purple emperor butterflies, the whole range. And it's a book written with passion. It could be a book like that, could be irritating because it could be all about, oh, look at us, we did this wonderful thing, and there is a bit of oh, look at this amazing list of species that we now have on our land. But actually Tree is very honest about the fact that they almost fell into doing this because intensive farming was failing for them on their land, and then they went out and visited, reworlding projects in other countries, and sort of learned and did the research and involved scientists and naturalists in sort of helping them plan what they do, and it sort of slightly made it up as they went along, but threw themselves quite bravely into this process. And the land in question is the Knepp estate. It's in West Sussex, so it's about 15-20 miles away from where I live, so I have been there to visit it, and it is glorious. It is amazing what they've done. Now, whether you could do that across the whole country, whether that would be a sensible thing to do, when we do also have to feed ourselves. I mean, the land is still productive. They produce, tremendous, naturally grazed meat on this land, but, you also do need, wheat and barley and lettuces and potatoes, to feed a country. So you can't rewild everywhere. But I did find it a really inspiring book, that if we can create pockets and corridors of land like they have at Knepp, it would transform the range of habitats and the welcome that is being denuded in this country, at least, for our native species of birds and animals and insects. And so I was delighted to read the book, and I can't wait to go and make another visit to Knepp and look at it with new eyes, having read the book, and also watch the documentary that's been made of the book, which I saw earlier this year, which is why I was particularly keen to read this book. So that was my 4 nonfiction November reads, all very different, all very enjoyable. I hope you had a lovely nonfiction November too. If you took part, I'd love to hear what you read. Did you do all 4 prompts, and what did you find to link with them? And I will do a wrap up of the rest of my November reading in a separate video, because I wanted to give the nonfiction a bit more space and love this year.